Welcome to Ask the Expert, a web series designed to provide you with practical information on business and finance. I'm your host, Nicole Pride. And whether you are running a nonprofit or plan to start one as your second act, our guest today, Nakita Burrell, is going to give you sage advice on how to run a financially fit nonprofit. Nakita is the Chief Financial and Administrative Officer at Ada S. McKinley Community Services, Inc., which empowers, educates, and employs people to change lives and strengthen communities. In her role at Ada S. McKinley Community Services, Nakita is responsible for financial strategy and management, risk management, information technology, and facilities management. Prior to Ada, Nakita served as the Director of Finance and Administration at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, and she began her career at PwC Chicago, one of the premier accounting firms in the world. So, Nakita, welcome.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Nicole. Thank you.
So happy to have you here today. I know so many people, like I mentioned, either work in a nonprofit, but have philanthropic hearts. And people have many ambitions of starting nonprofits, during retirement. And a lot of folks have maybe some misconceptions too, what nonprofits are all about. For example, some people even think of nonprofits as like not a business. Isn't that something?
Oh, that is something, and that's not true.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Exactly.
definitely a business. It's just a business that isn't designed or wasn't created with a vision to have a profit.
Mhm.
However, not for profits is what I like to call them, can have surpluses, and those surpluses can be used to help create reserve funds for future spending.
There you go. There you have it. So let's get into it. So, Nikita, please tell us a little bit. We talked about you and your role now at Ada McKinley. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the organization that you're in?
Yeah, I sure can. So Ada's been around is a century plus old organization that was started by a Black woman in 1919. And
Okay.
her goal, Ada S. McKinley, her goal was basically to help Black veterans returning from the First World War to get
Mm,
acclimated back into civilian life because, as you can imagine, when they were returning home, there were not a lot of opportunities for Black men in those days. And she helped
mhm.
get set up and get situated so that they could not only just survive, but thrive, in civilian life.
Oh, that's awesome. That's
It
just an
is, isn't
awesome
it?
mission. Yeah. Which is still very much needed today.
It
Shout out
absolutely
to all
is.
of the veterans out there who protect and serve us and sometimes have a hard time with reentry into civilian life, right? So
Yeah.
thank you for that. And then also you started out, oh, well, not started out, but prior to this role, you were at another nonprofit. Can you
Well,
tell us?
yeah, I was at so I was in the philanthropic world, whereas Ada is more of the nonprofit world. I worked for a foundation called Robert R. McCormick Foundation and Cantini Foundation. And they were foundations that gave money away to organizations like Ada. So you need
Mm-hmm.
both.
Mm-hmm.
And a plethora of other types of entities to help move the needle on a lot of the issue areas that a lot of nonprofits deal with. Um,
Yeah, so thank you for that distinction. I don't know if a lot of folks realize that. So there are the foundations and associations that give money, like one of the biggest ones I can think of, like Lilly Foundation,
yeah.
Robert Wood Johnson Foundation,
Yep.
right, that give to other nonprofits so that they can do their work.
Yeah.
And so is there a different organizational structure, legal structure?
You can still have the same type of organization and legal structure. It's just really the difference is one type of organization, philanthropic organizations are giving their money away to nonprofits who have boots on the ground doing that work every day. So that's the biggest distinction.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
that's a great distinction to make. And so, the fact that these organizations, like the associations that give money away, may not have um, their finger on the pulse of what's happening on the ground, right? And
Right,
so
right.
they may come, I guess, for those who either wanna start an association or who's working at one now, what are some things you think that these associations should consider, as they're either deciding to give away money or evaluating how the money is being used?
Yeah. And so really and associations are actually a third type of nonprofit, but really we're looking at the foundation world and the
Mhm,
foundations who have nice size endowments. Like from McCormick Foundation, they have about a $2 billion endowment. So they're
mhm,
giving away 100 million plus a year to different organizations or different not-for-profits with their boots that have boots on the ground in specific issue areas that are important to them. And so
mhm,
foundations will decide what those issue areas are, and they'll
mhm,
focus on that. Now, the thing is that it could change or, shift. They could pivot at any point in time of their history. But for the most part, they tend to stay steady in their particular mission, and they'll focus on organizations or nonprofits that are doing the everyday work and help fund those organizations, if that makes any sense.
It does, it does. And so, I guess on the other side, for the not-for-profits who are who are applying for grants, have to report on how the money's being used, what are some things that you think those not-for-profits should keep in mind, as they're applying or reporting?
That's a great question. As not-for-profits are looking for different funding, they want to really try and mesh their vision and their mission with with funders that have the same type of vision and mission. The reason is because when it comes down to the type of programming that they're offering, it would behoove that not-for-profit to be as close to or similar missions for the people that are funding them or the organizations that are funding them. And the reason is because you don't have to create new programs in order to get some particular funding.
Mhm,
Let's just say if your organization is focused on substance abuse, it would be good, it's good to go after grants that are specifically around the subject matter that that organization is an expert in, which is substance abuse.
mhm.
You know?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point because I know a lot of folks. They try to bend backwards. They have
Yeah.
somewhat of mission creep, right? They
Yep.
change who they are just because they're so hungry for the dollars, and they kind of drift away
Yeah.
from their true mission, right? And so having the discipline to seek after funders that are closely aligned to their mission makes a lot of sense.
It
Yeah,
really
yeah.
does. And then it'll make it easier for the not-for-profit to report against, for outcomes or report on the financial well-being of the organization for that particular program, because they'll have subject matter experts, or hopefully have subject matter experts on staff
Mhm.
versus, oh, let's go for a janitorial contract that will service government buildings, and they just don't know anything about it. They don't realize all the stipulations that come with a particular contract because they're not experts in it. So my recommendation for folks who are starting a not-for-profit is to have a very relatively narrow approach, master that approach, and then slowly expand. If they want to, you can expand, but start with what you know and focus on that and go after those types of dollars. Because
That's
you're more
really
than likely you have a better chance of getting them.
yes. And as you're talking, I think it would be helpful to even explain in a little bit more detail about like what your role is because you're talking about strategy now, right? Very much so. And I
Yeah.
think, as the CFO, some folks may think it's just all about the budget, but there's more to it than that. You're thinking long-term vision, financial projections, and things like that. So if you can go into a little bit more detail, that would be great.
Well, absolutely. So e- as the CFAO for my organization, I do have responsibility not just for finance and treasury, but I also have responsibility for making sure that our IT department is working well, making sure that our basically our facilities management department is working well, and then
Mhm.
also quality assurance or risk management. Um, and so with that in mind, I have to step outside of my own comfort zone because my background is within accounting and finance. So I have to step outside of my own comfort zone and kind of broaden a little bit, and just to make sure that I have a good understanding across that board. So
Mhm.
as we're talking about financial management in particular, and strategy, again, have that narrow focus. Make sure that you are managing your cash flow very tightly. I would also recommend that for new startup, not for profits, you pay cash for everything. Pay cash for everything. If you can't pay cash for it, you cannot afford it.
Mhm.
And then also making sure that before you sign your name on any type of grant or contract, that you understand the reporting that's going to be required for you to complete once that contract or grant period is over with.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Yeah, and again, people just sometimes want to go after the money so much they don't consider all the responsibilities that surrounds receiving the money, the funding.
Yeah.
So you mentioned risk management. So what does that look like? What are some things that someone in your role would consider to help mitigate risk?
Yeah. So it really depends on the type of funding that you have and the type of programming that you're providing. So if you're working with people who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, they are a protected class, which means that it's highly regulated. So for us, as a for instance, or in our sector, there is a lot of regulation that goes into making sure that we have good case notes, that we are providing the correct medication for the people that we're supporting, those types of things. We need to make sure that we're following through on all of that, and somebody needs to watch and make sure that's happening. So we have a whole department for that.
Mhm.
Because if you don't, then the organization could easily get into trouble.
Mhm.
And that's just one example.
That's great because what I hear you saying is that um, should really understand legal parameters surrounding the the category that you're in, and
Yep.
maybe if you are a startup too, it's just having a consultant or a lawyer to be
Mhm.
able to give guidance and advice about things to consider and look out for, and to make sure that there are some legal structure in place.
Absolutely. And that includes insurance, making sure that you have good insurance so that in the event something does happen, you're protected. The organization is protected. The board
Mhm.
members are protected. So we're going through our insurance renewal right now. And one of the
Mhm.
lines of coverage that we get every single year is directors and officers insurance. So that in the event something happens and somebody wants to sue, that means our board is protected because they're a volunteer board. And even if they weren't, we would still need to protect them
Mhm.
because they're providing advice on our behalf, on behalf of the organization to make sure that that organization flourishes. You don't want them having to fight lawsuits. So you protect your board, you protect your staff, you protect the organization.
Mhm. And those are specific insurance for each of those categories that you just mentioned.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. So directors and officers insurance, you would have, depending if you have property or not, you may have property insurance, always general liability insurance,
Mhm.
um, employee liability insurance or employee practice liability insurance. So
Mhm.
there's lots of different lines of coverage. What would be good would be to meet with an insurance broker
Mhm.
who specializes in non-for-profits.
Perfect. That's
Yeah,
great advice.
yeah.
And I don't know if there's a particular formula about how much insurance you should have based on the number of employees
It's
or
more of an art.
yeah,
And so the meaning insurance brokers can help with that, helping you
right.
decide what's the right level of coverage to get for your organization.
Yes.
But
Okay.
for organizations that are just, for people who are just starting out, they're not going to necessarily need all of that. Most of the time when people are starting out with not-for-profits, they're starting with themselves, and that's it.
Right. Right. And some
So,
volunteers, right? Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so this is great advice. So, how about let's shift gears a little bit and talk about budgeting and funding. Well, we talked a little bit about funding, but like financial projections. And I guess, is there a particular way that the book should be handled and some of the nitty gritty regarding budgeting and finances?
Yes. I would always, I am, I'm an accountant by trade.
Hmm.
I started out in auditing, moved over to accounting and corporate finance or financial analysis, before moving into the philanthropic and not-for-profit worlds.
Hmm.
But you definitely need a good accounting system. If you're just starting out, something like QuickBooks is good to start with. If you're not familiar with QuickBooks, I would take either a bookkeeping class or hire a bookkeeper, depending on how much funding you have. And you're going to want to get
Right.
somebody who you want to basically get a bookkeeper who understands grant accounting. That is super important because not every organization is created the same. For the for-profit world, you're going to want somebody who is familiar with running or helping with the bookkeeping for a for-profit company. And then for the not-for-profit world, you want somebody who's familiar with that, right? So, all bookkeepers are not created equal. They're not all experts in everything. It's like saying, I'm going to get an attorney. And what kind of attorney? Real estate attorney,
Yes.
lawyer,
Yes.
you want somebody who can read contracts. What are you looking for? So it's different types. So it's good to keep that in mind. I would say the other thing, as far as budgeting is concerned, one of the things that we look at ADA is the fact that we do have evergreen contracts. So basically contracts that do renew every year, um,
Mhm.
as long as we're doing what we're supposed to do, right?
Right.
And so we can take that information and that will help inform us what our revenue is going to look like for the next year, as well as what our expenses are going to look like for the next year.
So, Nikita, this is so rich. This is so helpful. And so, you touched on this a little bit earlier when talking about using the example of constituents who may have certain disabilities and really needing to adhere to regulatory issues and things like that. So, when I heard you talk about that, what I heard in the back of my mind was like compliance issues and being compliant. Is there more that you want to say about that or can say?
Yeah. So from a financial perspective, here's what I would say.
Mhm.
Before you sign any contract or take on any grant, make sure that you really read through the requirements of that particular grant or that contract. Also, before you sign, get from the funding agency whatever reporting they are going to require you to do. Find out if they're going to audit you or review your work each year, because that's a very distinct possibility, especially as you're dealing with more vulnerable populations, because they need to make sure that you're not just taking the money and spending it on something that doesn't have anything to do with the programming that you should be providing or the
Now,
service
the
that you should be
information that
providing.
you're talking about, is that typically included in the RFP, or do you have to dig deeper and ask and inquire about
It
these?
may or may not. It really depends on the funding agencies.
Mhm.
Here's the thing, a lot of our funding is federal and state.
Mhm.
So, and not all funding agencies have the same level of engagement with their grantees, which
Mhm.
is us, right?
Mhm.
So
Yep.
sometimes we have to ask, sometimes it's already included in the packet, and we
Mhm.
read through it, make sure that we understand it, and make sure it's worth our time, right? Because we don't want to end up going through a 6-month audit for, let's say, uh, one 1% of our annual revenue. That's a lot of work.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
So it
great.
needs, the juice needs to be worth the squeeze.
So, is there like some place to go to get like a list of questions to ask funders when you're considering the process, or a good resource, or
That's a good question. It really depends. It depends on what sector you're working with. And if you're working with federal and state contracts, one good source is the uniform guidance because it tells you, it kind of it delves into the details of what kind of costs are allowable versus not. How do you set your indirect rate cost? And this is the indirect rate cost is basically, or the indirect cost rate is basically people like me. So I'm not on the boots. I'm not doing the direct services, but I'm supporting the program
Mhm.
indirectly.
Right,
If it
right.
makes any
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yes. And also working or networking with other organizations, maybe in other areas, but within the same sector
Hmm.
is super. I've found super helpful. When I first started at Ada, I had no idea
Hmm.
how much regulatory reading and understanding I would need to gain in order to help run the organization.
Hmm.
But I reached out to my counterparts at different not-for-profits doing the same type of work in other areas of the country and other areas of the state, and they're
Hmm.
more than happy to share like what things that they've had to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. Networking.
It is huge. It is
Yes,
huge.
yes, 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 yes. So, are there any strategies or advice that you have about being able to control overhead costs?
No.
Oh,
Well, here's the one thing I will say.
yes.
It's definitely we even find that challenging because
Mhm,
in one part, our biggest expense across the board, whether it's overhead or direct services, is going to be our people.
mhm,
So they're the biggest expense, or I like to call it our biggest investment, right? Because they're the ones that are out there making this organization run. Whether they're providing direct services, whether they're providing support to the folks that are doing direct service. We need those people. And a lot of times I know there's this kind of like misconception that, oh no, we can't give people raises within not-for-profits, but there's no way you're going to be able to keep good employees, good staff, good teams if you do not pay them. And
mhm,
so it really comes back to, okay, when you're negotiating these contracts, when you're negotiating these grants, how can we increase that indirect cost rate to accommodate the fact that we still have to pay the folks that are supporting these different programs that are not within the programs themselves? How do we
mhm.
make that work? So our approach has been to see what we can do to increase the dollars upfront to make sure that we can accommodate the cost of basically doing business and keeping the doors open.
Yeah, yeah. And so do you find that most funders, they do not want the monies to go toward, you know, people or administrative costs and really go more to service-based type
Yeah.
of activity?
It can happen like that. And I think one of the things that anybody who's dealing directly with a funder can do is to have those realistic conversations. You
Mhm,
can't have, let's just say you're supporting somebody in a long-term care facility that can't really take care of themselves. Well, guess what? You're going to need you're going to need to have the lights on. You're going to need somebody who can actually help with the reporting that reports back to that funding agency to say, hey, this is what's going on. This is where we're spending the money, which is basically an accountant
mhm,
working with the program. You're
mhm,
also going to need somebody to help maintain that particular home, facilities management, somebody on the quality assurance side to make sure that the folks who are providing that direct service are actually taking care of the case notes that need to happen so that we can report against it. And then even with IT and HR, right? IT to make sure that our cybersecurity is intact, and of course,
mhm.
everybody knows human resources and know what they do. So all of these things are important. It's something that has to be negotiated, I think, up front.
Yeah, and so you've been on both sides. Do you think that the funders are receptive of those
I think
conversations?
so. I really do think so. It'd be one thing if your overhead costs were 50% of your overall cost.
Mhm.
But honestly, if we're looking in the realm of like it's growing a little bit, I want to say it's 15% or less, then I think you're in decent shape.
Mm.
So if
Okay.
your overhead costs are 15% or less of your total cost, then you're in pretty decent shape.
You said 15.
15, 1 5.
Yes. Yeah, I just want to make sure. Not
Not
50.
50.
Yeah.
1 5. So because really what funders want to see, whether it's a foundation, an individual, federal or state agencies, they want to see that you are spending the money for the cause.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so tell me, as a CFO, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I named a couple of things already. So the first thing for me is cash flow. Cash is king in the not-for-profit world. If you don't have
Mhm.
cash, you cannot operate. You can't pay your bills, you can't pay your people. Um, and then the other thing for me would be cybersecurity and just making sure that we're safeguarding the assets of the organization.
Mm,
There's
yeah.
so much that's been happening over the last several years, especially pandemic era. It just kind of blew up where um, bad actors were really trying to take advantage of all types of organizations, and not for profits were not off the list.
Right.
Everybody's been a victim at one point, or not everybody, but a lot of organizations have found themselves victims of scams, whether it's phishing
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
otherwise.
And and I guess in particularly for donor information too, and you have
Mhm.
like sensitive information for like credit cards and things like that.
Right.
And so even if you're a small nonprofit just starting out, what safeguards do you recommend that they put in place?
Yeah. Where you can, I would say, kind of separate your duties a little bit. So,
Mhm.
as an example, if somebody, if you have somebody on your team who is collecting all of the revenue that comes in the door, whether it's grant money or whatever, so that it can get paid out and pay for different services, then you have somebody else who's going to reconcile that account. Somebody
Mhm.
separate from somebody who's receiving. So we have one person receiving the money, the funds in the door, and
Mhm.
making note of all of that. Then you have
Mhm.
somebody else who is reconciling that bank account every single month. It can't be
Mhm.
two people, person.
Right. Checks and balances, right?
Yeah, so checks and balances. I would also, if you're receiving donations, use a third party who's
Mhm.
bigger than you, who's more
Mhm.
experienced than you,
Mhm.
and who has more cybersecurity in place,
Right.
because you
Mhm.
don't want to be responsible for anybody's information as a small startup, not for profit.
Right. And so that just looks like using an app that's known for
Yeah.
collecting donations or something
Yep.
like that, right? Mhm.
Yes, absolutely.
Subscribing to an app. Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. And then I think before we go, if you can just list, if you can just share with us any financial considerations that might be unique to nonprofits that they should consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, yes. And this honestly is for any organization or company, whether it's a not for profit or a for profit. Manage your cash flow. Manage
Mhm.
your cash flow is super, super important. When I first started at Ada, we had some pandemic era funding that took us, um, that really smoothed things out for us for a couple of years. After those couple of years were over, what I was noticing is that our cash flow was becoming very cyclical. And I'm like, no, no, no. What do we
Mm,
need to do to fix this? And it was
mhm,
happening around the time that we were renewing our contracts, or if we were doing revisions of budgets for those particular contracts,
mhm.
because there's a quiet period. So
Right.
you're doing a revision for, a contract with a government agency, they want you to stop sending in requests for reimbursement of expenses until that revision can be approved.
Mhm. And
Okay, well
just
that
so that I understand you correctly, is that you're looking for a steady flow of income that's consistent, particularly like what keeps you up at night is being able to pay your people, right? And
Pay
so
my
if you have
people,
these,
pay our
yeah,
vendors, keep the
yeah,
lights on.
yeah.
And it's not, it's really about cash. Cash is king. So, what I would say for people who are, whether they're in the for-profit world or the not-for-profit world, watch your cash.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking at all the revenue that you are recording on your books, but your accounts receivable is getting higher and higher and higher, that means you have a cash flow problem potentially. You need to be
Mm-hmm.
able to convert that AR into cash and bring that balance back down so that you're getting money into your bank account.
Mm-hmm.
I would say you'd want to build relationships with your funders because people will help people they like,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're talking about government agencies. And a lot of those agencies are understaffed, so they're just, you know, running from one fire to the next. But if you
Mm.
create those relationships, they'll pick up the phone, they'll hear you out, they'll push your funding through. The
And
other
what does that look like in practical terms to build those
Yeah,
relationships?
pick up the phone and call. Call and
Mm-hmm.
say, "Hey, I've as a CFAO, you know, some folks on my team are like, hey, we're not getting this funding." And I'm like, who do I send me the contact and you know, information for whoever I need to call. I will pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I'm making this up. Sheila, girl, look,
Mm-hmm.
we, you know, you're putting us in a cash crunch here. You guys owe us like $2 million. When can we expect to get that money in?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because nobody likes to get a phone call saying you owe us money. Nobody. And so what happens is that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
The other
Mm-hmm.
thing I would say too is secure a line of credit for your organization as soon as you can. When
Mm.
you're just starting out, you might not be able to do that. You don't have any assets.
Mhm,
And for the most part, you as an individual may be doing most of the work anyway, so you may not
mhm,
need it. But
mhm.
as you mature, that line of credit will help with those dips and it'll
Right.
smooth things out until, you know, you can right the ship again.
Mhm.
Um, I would say those two
Yeah.
things are super, super important.
It's funny, we just had a recent guest that talked about that, securing a line of credit before you need it.
Yeah, yes, yes, absolutely.
So this very helpful. And I guess, if I hear you correctly too, is that if if an organization knows one of their biggest funders, a grant is coming toward the end and you have to do the reporting and there may be a gap. And this is something, let's just say this is a grant that's like over the course of 4 years or something, and you know that there's this dip at a certain point, then, have other activities, whether it's fundraisers and things like that, that where you expect to have the monies in
Mhm.
during the time of that gap, right? So there's
Yeah,
like planning you need to do with your calendar.
absolutely. That's a
Or
very good point. I
Mhm.
would also say this, one of the things that we started doing was, you know, just because we get all this money in at one time doesn't mean we need to spend it all at one time. So what we're
Right.
doing is daily, I have my team shift a small percentage of any money that we have coming in the door to a savings account so that we can use that savings account kind of to help us float.
Mhm.
So we have the savings account, we have investments, and we also have a line of credit because I am very conservative when it comes to when it comes to cash.
Mhm.
We just need to make sure that we have different things in place
Mhm.
so that we can weather any dips in our cash flow.
Mhm.
So again, I would say line of credit, build the relationships with your funders so that you
Yes.
get that money quickly and they can go to bat for you to get that money quickly. Um,
Yeah.
create an informal reserve account or savings account, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So all those things and fundraising.
Perfect. So this is great. So Nikita, I'm just so grateful that you came out today and gave
Absolutely.
us all of this information. We're so happy that you were able to share with us, and we look forward to you coming back another time.
Of
And
course.
yeah, to be able to talk about even deeper.
Absolutely. I'm here for you.
All right. So thank you. So there you have it, folks. That is another episode of Ask the Expert. We meet you next week, same time, same place. Bye.